Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 203, Calvin's Shadow. Last time, John Calvin finally triumphed over his enemies at home, and in 1555, secured a small council totally committed to his idea of the Reformation. That does not mean everything was perfect. Calvin utterly failed to achieve the kind of pan-Swiss Reformed unity he dreamt of. Bern remained ominously present, and the specter of a Bernese invasion likewise so. In France, vicious Catholic prosecutions left the land smoking from all the Protestants burnt at the stake. In Geneva, Calvin, safe and sound, exhorted his followers to meet their deaths bravely. In our final episode on John Calvin, we watch as he finally gets what he wished for, and we consider Calvin's influence across the continent. A couple of things here before we get started. If you're interested in more content, check out the website at westerncivpodcast.com. If you'd like ad-free copies of the show, check out Patreon, patreon.com/westerncivpodcast, or to do the whole thing over again, start from the beginning with, let's face it, much better audio quality. Consider joining the subscriber feed at glow.fm/westernciv. Link in the show notes. You can hear all about Alexander the Great, the Mysticles, Ramses II, so on and so forth. Whole thing all over again. Check it out. By the early 1550s, Calvin was firmly in control of Geneva. This allowed him to do whatever he liked, with some disastrous consequences. One such example was the infamous case of Michael Servetus. Servetus was a former Catholic priest turned Reformed minister. The problem was that, while he taught and preached in Geneva, he did not go along with 100% of Calvin's theology. The differences between the two men are just too minute and irrelevant to bother describing in detail now. Calvin decided to make an example of Servetus. After a sham trial and giving Servetus what he felt like was more than enough opportunities to change his mind, Calvin had him burned at the stake. Now, up to this point in the Reformation, burning at the stake was really something only Catholics did to Protestants. As the Reformation moves along, it becomes much more of an eye for an eye sort of a thing. But up till now, the evangelicals have dealt with the brunt of the persecution. Calvin changed that when he had Servetus burned alive for heresy. Almost immediately, he regretted it. By 1553, opposition to this kind of harsh practice was growing in Basel. There, Calvin was now vilified as much of a monster as the Pope himself. The point of Protestantism, these men argued, was having a dialogue. Now, interestingly, as we already know, none of our three early reformers, Luther, Zwingli, or Calvin, saw it that way. These men were just as intolerant as any pope. In the days after Servetus was executed, a number of notable figures quietly left Geneva. Suddenly, they wanted no part in this kind of reformation. Even in Geneva, there was so much uproar over the execution that Calvin, on December 11th, 1553, was called before the small council to explain himself. It took him only 2 weeks, but Calvin was able to put together a written defense which he, quite aptly, titled Defense of the Orthodox Faith Against the Errors of Michael Servetus. Completed in haste, it was far from Calvin's best work. But the message was uncompromising. Servetus, and anyone else who preached false doctrine, were the servants of Satan and had to be destroyed. The real question, however, was not about who was right or wrong theologically. It was whether or not the magistrates had the right and the power to punish a heretic. Calvin wrote that they absolutely did. Sure, Christ taught that the word was the sword and abhorred violence. But the Old Testament especially sanctioned its use. And Calvin latched on to that. He attacked the idea that gentleness was the way to address false teaching. Ultimately, he argued that the role of the magistrates was to maintain order, and maintaining order meant defending its very foundation, true religion. At this precise moment, however, a book entitled Concerning Heretics and Whether They Are to Be Persecuted appeared in Basel. Titles weren't really reformers' strong suit, FYI. This was no coincidence. The book was a scathing indictment of everything Calvin had just done. The author argued that no one should be persecuted on account of their faith, and that, in the words of Christ, enemies were to be tolerated until the end of time, since it did not fall for humans to separate the faithful from the unfaithful. 3 linked but distinct issues united Calvin's opponents at this point: the Servetus execution, a rejection of the broad principle of persecuting heretics, and hatred of his rigid doctrine of predestination. Throughout the 1550s, the treatment of heretics remained unresolved. The Servetus execution made Calvin an international figure for all the wrong reasons. For his opponents, Calvin now represented the utter failure of the Reformation. Something that began with the principle of Scripture first and justification by faith had denigrated into institutions of power and state-oriented interests. Yet, for all the opposition, the attacks on Calvin did not dislodge him, largely because the larger Swiss reform movement continued to back him. Calvin weathered the storm up to 1555, but as we discussed last time, the complete victory of his supporters allowed Calvin to take complete control over Geneva that year. Still, despite this political victory, the backlash over the death of Servetus deeply wounded Calvin. He reflected, late in 1555, that life was barely worth living. He wrote, "Believe me, I had fewer troubles with Servetus and have now with Westphal and his like than I have with those who are close at hand, whose numbers are beyond reckoning and whose passions are irreconcilable. If one could choose, it would be better to be burned once by the papists than to be plagued for eternity by one's neighbors. They do not allow me a moment's rest, although they can clearly see that I am collapsing under the burden of work, troubled by endless sad occurrences, and disturbed by intrusive demands. My one comfort is that death will soon take me from all this too difficult service. Meanwhile, back in Germany, the death of Luther and Charles V's victory over the Schmalkaldic League led to the Lutherans splitting into two camps. The Philippists, named and led by their leader, Philip Melanchthon, and the Gneissier, meaning true, both of whom claimed Luther's inheritance. The key distinction between the two groups came down to certain Catholic rituals that Melanchthon was willing to adopt as a compromise with the Catholics, while the Gneissier party was absolutely unwilling to even entertain such discussions. Calvin, unwisely, decided to wade into the debate, criticizing Melanchthon for his willingness to accept too many Catholic practices for the sake of peace. When Melanchthon received the letter, he is said to have torn it up. The biggest issue during this period continued to be the division of the Protestant churches. Not only were the Lutherans divided, but all Protestants, Swiss, English, German, etc., continued to be woefully disunified from one another. When a prominent Lutheran Gneissier named Westphal, who was just mentioned in Calvin's writing, launched a major attack on Calvin, Melanchthon, and Bullinger, Calvin stressed the need to reply with a unified voice. Quote, "The Lutherans, a contentious and ruinous lot of men without understanding and culture, are persecuting us more than the Papists. They are renewing an interrupted battle. I doubt whether we should continue to gloss over their savage and illiterate writings. Westphal, that true Westphalian, a stupid and barbarous man, published another book on the Lord's Supper, in which he lashed out at our orthodox teaching on the supper." End quote. Calvin himself didn't want to be the one to make the reply because to do so would imperil further negotiations with the Lutherans. But if he failed to respond, then that might hurt his standing with the Swiss churches because he hadn't stood up for them. Ultimately, Calvin had to do the work himself and sent a draft in September to Bullinger for comment. When Bullinger failed to respond, Calvin once more had to go it alone. He wrote an open letter to the Swiss churches, presenting their undeniable differences and disagreements, but did so in terms of a tone of overall unity, still trying to bring the churches together. The differences between the reformers, Calvin stressed, were not in terms of theology, but simply expression. He wrote, "And yet I do not conceal that he, Westphal, afterwards collects different opinions which, though they're not in reality irreconcilable, do nevertheless present the appearance of contradiction. But first, if an argument has been expressed by anyone incidentally, he maliciously lays hold of it as if it were a full definition." End quote. This was a pretty bold statement, but Calvin continued to press it, writing, moreover, "Nor if those excellent and distinguished servants of Christ, Zwingli and Oecamplus, were still alive, they would change a single word in that resolution. For that man of glorious memory, Martin Bucer, in a letter to me, when he had read it congratulating according to his whole piety of the church." End quote. Calvin's peacemaking, however, only extended so far. He needed the Swiss to be willing to give a little. He praised Zwingli, something he'd never done before in writing, but also indicated that the Swiss needed to accept Martin Bucer's legacy. Moreover, the Swiss were required to acknowledge a position on the Lord's Supper which favored Calvin's spiritual interpretation of the sacrament, as opposed to Zwingli's symbol-only interpretation. In other words, Calvin was more than willing to make concessions to the rest of the Swiss, but they had to at least acknowledge the existence of a wider Protestant movement. Calvin was far from sure they would do this, and he wrote to his fellow pastor Farel, expressing the same. Zurich would ultimately issue a response, but it took its time in doing so. Some of the language that Calvin was proposing was fine to them. But Calvin's favorable account of Martin Luther? Well, for the descendants of Zwingli, that was almost too much to endure. Still, they did respond, and Calvin revised his text before issuing a reply. He changed his writing on Luther, admitting that Luther had been far too vicious toward the Swiss in his writings. After receiving the revised document, the Zurichers made it clear that they would continue to support Calvin. And so Calvin issued a revised defense of the sound and orthodox doctrine of the sacraments. He then wrote to Melanchthon, desperate that he would accept it. If Melanchthon did, then Calvin would have achieved something that no other reformer ever had: a unified Protestant front. Calvin was a deeply divisive figure in the German lands. Frankly, what Calvin wanted, an open alliance between Protestants and the Swiss Confederation in Germany, was not something that Melanchthon could even offer. So the game was doomed from the get-go. Melanchthon, under attack from the Niceno-Lutherans, was in no position to try to sell anyone on the idea of an alliance with Geneva. Calvin quickly lost patience, as he tended to do, writing to Melanchthon that he was certain that the two men could resolve their differences over predestination, and pressuring Melanchthon to issue a statement of solidarity over the Lord's Supper. Melanchthon would do nothing of the sort, and certainly did not want to get dragged into Calvin's fight with Westphal, who, while Calvin was writing to Melanchthon, was busy launching another attack on John Calvin. Westphal now went for the jugular, arguing that Calvinist theology reduced the Lord's Supper to nothing more than a hollow sign. Calvin responded in a work titled A Second Defense of the Pious and Orthodox Faith as follows: We detest the dishonesty of those who invidiously disseminate among the people that we take away the presence of Christ from the supper and measure the power of God by our own sense, as if the sublime nature of this mystery, namely, that Christ, though remaining in heaven as to the locality of his body, yet descends to us by the secret agency of his Spirit, so as to unite with us and make us partakers of his life, did not transcend the human dialect. Bullinger also tried to intervene, but to no avail. Calvin's problem, and one that he did not recognize, was that most leading Lutherans sided with Westphal, and so fighting with him wasn't getting him any friends in Germany. While concessions on the major points of Zwinglian theology simultaneously cost him support in Switzerland. Calvin could not get the pan-European Protestant unity he so desperately desired. It didn't exist now, and it would never exist. He was going to have to choose, whether he knew that yet. Geneva could ally itself with the Swiss churches or the German ones. Not both. At first, Calvin, having invested so much, tried desperately to maintain the charade that he and Melanchthon were on the same page, no matter how impossible that appears in hindsight. Calvin's efforts only grew more desperate as the persecutions of Protestants in France picked up speed in the late 1550s. Calvin believed his only hope was to present a united front of Protestantism to Francis I. But that seemed all but impossible at this point. Finally, in 1557 at Worms, the whole house of cards fell apart. There, Melanchthon, under tremendous pressure in Germany, formally condemned the Zwinglians. This slammed the door on any prospect of Swiss-German unity. Moreover, Zurich felt itself totally betrayed by Calvin, who it had felt negotiated in bad faith and misled it in terms of Melanchthon's actual intentions, which, to be fair to them, clearly Calvin had. After all his efforts, Geneva's Reformed Church in 1557 was now more isolated than ever. Now, not even Zurich stood alongside it. All John Calvin could do was wring his hands and sulk. Before moving on, we need to consider the influence of Calvinism on Europe in general. Certainly, the tremendous growth of Calvinism, quote-unquote, in the second half of the 16th century. It's kind of tempting to conclude as a result of that growth that Calvin enjoyed widespread support across Europe by 1550. Certainly, his growing reputation brought scholars to Geneva and functioned to build a growing network of disciples from the court of Henry VIII through the German cities and down into the Swiss Confederation. Still, his was not the only voice. Bullinger had significant contacts in England. Melanchthon was, to a large degree, still considered to be the preeminent Reformed scholar in Europe. Calvin's voice existed alongside these others, but by no means did he put them in the shade. Still, Calvin was connected to the wider European Reformation in a few very important ways. He traveled extensively. This is very different from Luther and very different from Zwingli. He visited Bern, Zurich, Basel, and cities outside the Swiss Confederation, like Frankfurt and Strasbourg. And of course, at home, he continued to receive visitors from across France, the Empire, Italy, and even from some parts of Eastern Europe. In terms of European news, Bullinger and Calvin were more or less tied together in the public imagination, as the former did his best to keep the latter up on information. Yet it was through Bucer, not Bullinger, that Calvin became aware of events in England, which we're going to get into much greater detail in a few future episodes. During the darkest days of the Reformation, the court of Henry VIII and Archbishop Cranmer provided a ray of hope for Calvin and all other reformers. From Henry's divorce from Catherine of Aragon until the fall of Anne Boleyn, Henry was an active patron of the evangelicals. Things changed dramatically in 1539, when Henry began taking control of the English church and seemed to turn his back on Luther. The wheel turned again in 1547, when Edward VI came to power. John Calvin developed a very close spiritual bond with Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset, regent to the young Edward VI. Somerset served as the Lord Protector of England from 1547 until his fall in 1549, events we'll talk about in much greater detail in future episodes. In 1548, Calvin sent Somerset a letter instructing him in the ways of the true religion, correctly identifying him as the man in charge.
Somerset found much that he liked. When the English revolted against his protectorate, Calvin wrote assuring him that it was right to crush the rebellion with the sword. Simultaneously, he urged Somerset to move faster in terms of religious reform. He consistently expressed despair that the pace of change in England was too slow compared to the continent. Moderation, Calvin wrote, does not extend to permitting anything that is contrary to divine will. After Somerset fell from power in 1549, Calvin continued to communicate with him. It was Somerset who actually translated 2 of Calvin's works into English while he was in prison. Still, it's clear from much of Calvin's correspondence that he was only vaguely aware of events taking place in England, and he never maintained more than a formal relationship with Thomas Cranmer. Their relationship grew later on, as Cranmer became interested in a wider union of European Protestantism. He wrote to Melanchthon, Bullinger, and Calvin, soliciting their support. Only Calvin replied enthusiastically, "The thing, also, is to be ranked among the chief evils of our time, that the churches are so divided, that human fellowship is scarcely in any repute among us, far less that Christian intercourse of which all make profession, but few sincerely practice. If men of learning conduct themselves with undue hesitation, the heaviest blame falls on the leaders themselves, who, engrossed in their own sinful pursuits, are indifferent to the safety and entire piety of the church, or who, satisfied with their own private peace, have no regard for others." Calvin urged Cranmer to call such an assembly and gather the divided Protestant churches. Still, by July 1550, Calvin was critiquing Cranmer for the same reason he had critiqued Somerset. The Reformation in England was moving too slowly and had made too many compromises. In particular, Calvin hated that the Mass was retained in the English liturgy. In the end, Calvin would be disappointed in the English Reformation. Frankly, apart from Calvin's contact with Somerset, Genevan influence on the Edwardian Church was limited. Strasbourg and Zurich were both more influential in England. To the north, Calvin was much more important. In 1560, John Knox succeeded in making Scotland the first quote-unquote Calvinist land. Unlike in Geneva, in Scotland, Knox had the complete support of the nobility immediately, so he could move at a blistering pace. Still, in order to keep up this pace, even Knox would need to make significant concessions to the nobility in terms of what kinds of behavior might be subject to discipline. Not everyone was in favor of a strict moral consistory. While Knox's success in Scotland was greeted with applause in Geneva, his other decisions proved less worthy of accolades. The death of Queen Mary I and the ascension of Elizabeth of England brought scores of Protestants back to the kingdom and, Calvin believed, gave him the perfect opportunity for a do-over. This time, he would be in control and guide the English Reformation. It was not to be. And it was not to be because of his acolyte in Scotland. Elizabeth flew into a rage when she read Knox's first blast of the trumpet against the monstrous regiment of women, a text which argued, amongst other things, that women had no right to rule. The Queen's wrath quickly turned on Geneva, and Calvin whom she believed to have been behind the publication. Calvin's association with Knox ultimately precluded any involvement in the English religious settlement of 1559, which led to the Acts of Supremacy and Uniformity. Still, over time, Calvin, somewhat through the back door, would prove important in the English Reformation. While Calvin himself might have been prevented from taking a part in the religious settlement, men carrying his ideas flooded the kingdom. These Calvinists never felt comfortable with the Elizabethan settlement and kept themselves separate in order to preserve discipline. Ultimately, this group of staunch Calvinists would play a major role both in the settlement of what would become New England and in the English Civil War.
Lesser known is the flourishing of Protestantism in Poland, especially around Krakow, from 1547 to 1553. In 1554, Polish nobles began reaching out to John Calvin, hoping that his Reformed Church would become their model. Sigismund II was receptive to the idea of reform. In 1555, the Polish Diet met and drew up a list of proposed reforms, including clerical marriage and a vernacular translation of the Bible. Hoping to remain within the Catholic Church, however, they sent a list of these proposed reforms to Pope Paul IV, who was, well, unreceptive. By the time of Calvin's death, the once promising prospect for the Reformation in the East looked very gloomy and wouldn't ever really catch fire. Protestantism arrived in the Low Countries early on. However, major efforts at repression, which we'll get way more into when we talk about Charles V in the next few weeks, made certain that there were not any organized Reformed churches until almost the time of Calvin's death. His influence over these churches, at least direct evidence that we can prove, is limited to a handful of letters. In the Netherlands, Calvin's demand that the faithful needed to choose between exile and martyrdom proved to be a bit too strong of medicine. Until the Dutch Revolt of 1566, Reformed preaching generally took place in secret. In the open, Dutch Reformed Christians had to pretend to toe the line, much to Calvin's chagrin. Still, when the Dutch churches emerged from hiding in the 1570s, it was clear that Calvin and Calvinism would have a major influence over their ongoing development. In the Netherlands, communities adopted a consistory and church governments essentially in line with Genevan practices, with a few modifications. Once again, Calvin's direct personal influence on the region was probably slight, but his indirect influence through publications and ministers trained in Geneva, that was enormous. One of the strengths of Calvinism, and of course, I hope I don't need to say this, but of course, John Calvin referred to his brand of doctrine as Reformed Christianity. He never called it Calvinism, because if you've listened to these episodes, you know that he's certainly not pompous enough to name the religion after him. Calvinism at this point is an anachronistic term that I'm using for simplicity. That term itself doesn't get used for decades after John Calvin's death. Anyway, one of the strengths of anachronistically Calvinism, as opposed to, say, the theology of Zwingli, was that Calvin never insisted on one form of a Christian community. This really does set him apart, by the way, from Martin Luther and from Ulrich Zwingli. As long as the commandments were obeyed and the Gospels preached, it was only reasonable that locals be allowed to modify the Genevan church model as needed. The important question for John Calvin was obedience to God. This message made Calvin the most powerful voice of his generation. He transformed the Reformation into a quest for inner spirituality and a vision of a church that would survive the charnel house that was the early modern world. And for all of its horrors, that world is God's creation, at least for Calvin. Now, evil, though, is where he draws a distinction. Evil was never God's handiwork. It was human sinfulness. Rebellion and disorder, those were the fruits of sin, according to John Calvin. It's pretty easy to see why, like Luther, John Calvin didn't believe in social revolution, unless you consider, the consistory and monitoring everyone's moral conduct to be a kind of social revolution, which I certainly do, but I guess he didn't. People, though, from an economic standpoint and from a social standing standpoint, according to John Calvin, needed to stay in their lane. They could change their vocations. Yeah, you can get a new job. But you can't change your social rank. The nobility were the natural ruling class. Calvin utterly rejected the Anabaptist quest for moral perfection in the world. In Calvin's world, the faithful live amongst the godless, and such is the will of God. Christians are never exempt from bad things happening to them in life, nor should they strive to create a world where they don't, because suffering was God's means of testing them. The faithful needed to stay in the mixed community with the damned, not separate themselves out. A well-ordered state free of strife was never a guarantee. It was something you had to work for. But when it did happen, it was a gift from God. Christians needed to have faith, like Job, for most of the book of Job, that God loved them, even though he remained inherently unknowable. That was why those who criticized predestination, according to Calvin, needed to just be quiet. They couldn't question that which they couldn't possibly fathom. For Calvin, the true church would always be persecuted. You couldn't avoid it. But the answer was never to separate from your persecutors. It's to deal with it or suffer martyrdom. Now, we should never forget for a moment that historical figures were real people. I try to remind us of this as much as I can. In 1555, at the height of his powers, John Calvin was 46, a widower now, and in failing health. Calvin already suffered from gout, and a lifetime of ceaseless work had taken a terrible toll on his body. His friends often describe him as little more than skin and bones. He ate sparingly, frequently fasting all day, which certainly did not improve his overall physical condition. In the autumn of 1558, his health took a turn for the worse, as he explained to Melanchthon in a letter. At first, when the fit came upon me, as I was asleep or dozing, it was not difficult for it to steal a march on me without my perceiving it, especially as it was accompanied by very troublesome and acute pains, to which I am well accustomed from a long familiarity with them. But when the shivering fit once seized me at supper time, I thought it quite sufficient to rid myself in my usual manner of my dysphagia by a rigid fasting. Nearly 6 weeks have now elapsed since I became acquainted with the nature of my complaint, during which I have been in the hands of doctors, who keep me shut up in my bedroom and pretty much confine me to bed, which I am protected by a double coverlet. In his later years, Calvin relied increasingly on his narrow circle of friends, though I should point out that after the death of his first wife, he never again remarried. Over the years, his circle of friends in Geneva had changed, but that became increasingly the case in the late 1550s, as an influx of French humanists injected a jolt of much-needed youth and energy into Geneva. Friendship was very important to Calvin and was ultimately grounded by faithfulness to the cause. You were friends with Calvin because you agreed with him as to the interpretation of the Gospels. Loyalty, much more than personality, is what mattered to John Calvin. In his later years, Calvin turned increasingly to a book of the Bible from which he always drew comfort, the Psalms. In January 1557, he persuaded the Genevan Small Council to introduce the singing of psalms as a part of worship. Again, this is a major break with the medieval church. Singing by part of the whole congregation, not just the choir, became a regular part of church service during the Reformation. While singing the psalms during worship, during the week, Calvin regularly lectured on the book of Psalms, said lectures drawing large crowds. The Psalms, Calvin taught, were God speaking directly to humankind, an interpretation he drew comfort from. For example, Psalm 90 provided the perfect justification for Calvin's doctrine. Psalm 90 reflects the fickle nature of human life. Humans believe that they can avoid God's judgment, but such cannot be. All will be judged at some point. Evil never goes unpunished. The ungodly, Calvin taught and lectured, felt God's wrath as a dog on the leash, struggling to free themselves, but ultimately unable. The faithful, by contrast, understand the purpose for God's anger and respond with humility and remorse. Under Calvin, Geneva had also been transformed into a major printing center. Calvin himself printed at least 100,000 works, 100,000, between 1550 and his death in 1564. But his was not the only writing flying off the printing press. Between 1536 and 1563, an astonishing 150 completed Bibles and New Testaments were completed and printed in the city. But I don't want to oversell the importance of this. Europe remained in 1550 an overwhelmingly illiterate and spoken society. Sermons and lectures were how Calvin delivered his message. Calvin printed his sermons, but we don't have his voice. So obviously, it's difficult for us now to imagine what it would have been like to hear him preach. Speaking in a church in the early 16th century would have been much more like speaking in a bar than a library. The preacher had to contend with crying infants, barking dogs, general chatter, and the occasional fistfight. To preach meant to have a powerful, commanding voice. Calvin must have had such a voice. He also had an incredible command over the subject matter. Calvin was so busy that he certainly did not have time to prepare his sermons in advance. So he spoke extemporaneously, the Bible open before him. and he was always trying to connect the words in the gospel to the current situation. This excerpt from a sermon from the late 1550s, which of course is written, makes almost direct reference to the refugee situation in Geneva. Quote, "We've seen battles for such a long time. There is no end to them. And even apart from battles, we've seen how many people have been killed by wars. This has not been the case merely in one place in a single army, but has gone on among princes who claim to be Christians and Catholics, and yet they are killing an infinite number of people. One sees poor people dead among the bushes, and others who have to endure hunger and thirst, heat and cold, and many deprivations, to such a degree that if you cut their throat, you would do them a favor. For they're suffering and will die 10 times, so to speak, before death strikes them a final blow." End quote. When preaching, he constantly brought the word of God to the circumstances of the community and individuals. Here's another short example. It is a good thing that we progress in continuous growth. We should not always stay at the same level. When we receive education today, we should profit from it according to the knowledge we have received. Tomorrow, we will have another sermon and then a new lecture. Is that useless? Not at all. John Calvin held up a mirror to the congregation. Then he simply stepped back and he asked people what they saw. Here's one final excerpt from another sermon that I think brings that point home. He wrote, "How often do we remind ourselves of the content of the sermons in order to benefit from it? How do we talk about it at home? Most of them seem to think it's sufficient to hear one sermon on Sunday as a rule. When they return, they only talk about wicked and worldly plans, instead of considering what was said in the sermon, so that they better remember what the subject has dealt with. No, they say. It only makes us depressed to think about that. Let's not agonize over it." Nothing has shaped our view of John Calvin more than his belief in the disciplining of Christian society. To an extent, this is a mistake. Unlike Martin Bucer, he did not make said discipline an actual part of the church itself. He left the task of disciplining Geneva to the consistory, which is actually technically separate from the church, but to be fair, became increasingly intrusive over the last 10-ish years of Calvin's life. Almost 7% of Genevan society appeared before the consistory each year to answer for their moral behavior. And Calvin himself took an increasingly vocal role during its meetings, often admonishing offenders himself from the bench. That must have been imposing. For Catholics, I suppose, it'd be the equivalent of being scolded by the Pope himself. More often than not, though, Calvin attended only when there was a complicated case that required his expertise. And apparently, his presence worked. There were very few repeat offenders. Oh, and did I mention verdicts from the consistory were read aloud to everyone by the town crier? If that doesn't forestall reviticism in a society where everyone knows everyone else, I don't know what will. Some of Calvin's involvement in the social fabric of Geneva, I will confess, was very positive. Specifically, his 1546 marriage ordinances completely reshaped the medieval understanding of marriage, and certainly for the better. He argued for the mutual consent of men and women and the freedom of the marriage contract. Consensual engagements, he felt, were essential. Children were not to be forced into marriages without their consent. Likewise, newcomers to the city had to wait 1 year until they could even consider marriage. Society had to know whether or not they could approve of you, after all. The consistory watched carefully over all engagements, and the ordinances were strictly upheld. Cohabitation or premarital sex were absolutely forbidden, as I'm sure you could guess. Overall, Calvin had pretty positive views on marriage, especially for the time, though in an extremely odd contradiction. He counseled rape victims to marry their assailants, feeling otherwise they might fall into prostitution, and that is definitely not the number one problem in that scenario. Calvin's consistory upheld the ideal of a family home, with a mother, father, children, and young servants. In general, Geneva followed the lead of other reformed Swiss cities. You could sue for divorce on the grounds of spousal deformity, polygamy, incest, and abandonment, but that was about it. Ultimately, the goal was to keep husbands and wives together no matter what. In this respect, Geneva was no different from anywhere else in the Swiss Confederation. In Zurich, for example, warring spouses could be locked in a tower with only bread and water until they worked out their differences. The consistory would also intervene in the family in cases involving parents and children, nearly always siding with the parents. Calvin also sought, to an extent, and I don't want to overplay this point, but talk about it briefly. To an extent, he tried to control economic life in the city. He understood that commerce was necessary, but he believed that it needed to be regulated to prevent truly atrocious excesses. Reasonable profit was acceptable, but he lumped together usury with all other economic activity in which merchants fleeced innocent people. Calvin proposed a 5% cap on interest for commercial credit, as well as proposing standards for wages and better working conditions. At times, while in Geneva, he was able to enforce a few of these ideas, but never completely. Along with the consistory and the company of pastors, schools were essential to Calvin's community of the godly. In the 1541 ordinances, Calvin recognized the need for schools to train young men for both ecclesiastical and civic service. Calvin established, quote-unquote, the academy, a term actually rarely in use at the time, made up of two parts: the Latin school, or schola privata, and the upper school, schola publica. The Latin school was for younger children, and the upper school, what we would say probably young adults. While Calvin considered the upper school more important, most Genevans felt the opposite. In addition to simple reading, writing, and rhetoric, the academy served a crucial function in building the Reformed Church. There were courses on Reformed theology and catechism. In particular, it was important for people converting from Catholicism to Protestantism, Reformed Christianity, of course, especially given, as we've discussed several times, that there's really no such thing as Protestant orthodoxy right now. Calvin's involvement with the academy was significant. During his final years, he lectured there 3 times a week. Now, it evolved too late in his life for Calvin to leave a significant mark on the academy. Still, its establishment was a significant part of his legacy. Calvin never stopped revising his theology through the Institutes, his major written work dealing with the Reformed faith, almost up to his death. He was very different in this regard from Martin Luther, who never really altered any of his views once he codified or at least put down on paper what they were. Each edition of the Institutes, on the other hand, were developed from Calvin's unceasing study of the Scriptures. So let's take a look at the Institutes in their final published version to see what conclusions we can draw about their theological vision, since really it's the final draft of the Institutes that forms the basis of Calvinism going forward. According to the Institutes, God is revealed in the creative order, and all humans possess some sense of the divine. This knowledge strips humanity of any excuse for not acknowledging God, but, of course, it's not sufficient for salvation. Knowledge is not enough to simply get into heaven. Scripture is essential to reveal God's redeeming action, and God can only be known through Jesus Christ as it is revealed in the Bible. In a major distinction with Martin Luther, in his last version of the Institutes, Calvin makes it clear that God creates and cares for his creation. God is not a distant, unknowable, stern, father-like figure. Calvin's God is much more personal. In the second book of the Institutes, Calvin makes clear that humans can only be saved by external help, and this is the work of Jesus Christ. He also addresses the law given to Moses and explains that it has three forms and purposes. It teaches, it's used to control the community, and of course, it instructs the faithful to submit to the will of God. He treats the Old and New Testaments as fundamentally the same, though the superiority of the New is stressed, and argues for the essential role of Christ in salvation and for his human and divine natures. Faith is what brings the presence of Christ into the believer. In the end, the 1559 Institutes, which is the final version, is a masterpiece of organization and clarity. Calvin's goal was to present a comprehensive vision of his doctrine, and he certainly succeeded. He maintains that this doctrine is what the Church has always taught. Of course, I want to be clear, by this he does not mean what the Roman Catholic Church has always taught. Calvin means, from his perspective, the quote-unquote true church. But Calvin also makes it clear that his doctrine does not in any way, shape, or form replace Scripture, which remains the sole authority for the Christian. The official purpose of the Institutes was evangelical, to bring people to God. Now, to a large extent, Calvin's constant revisions of the Institutes reflects his own struggle with how to teach people the truth. Even for the master of language and rhetoric that he was, Calvin seems to have felt this ultimately impossible. Writing, "I urge my readers not to confine their mental interest within these two narrow limits, that is, within the Institutes, but to strive to rise much higher than I can lead them. For whenever this matter is discussed, when I have tried to say all, I feel that I have as yet said little in proportion to its worth.
Calvin's theology is both expressed here at the pulpit and through the consistory as three words that he repeats over and over and over again. And if you take anything away from this episode, these three words are going to become the cornerstones of Calvinism, even more than predestination. And those are obedience, submission, and humility. We'll see them come up a lot. Calvin clearly believed that the Reformed Church was the true church, revealed by God through Calvin, and that all other efforts were null. Unfortunately, as he sat in Geneva in the final years of his life, Reformed Christianity began to take on a life of its own. During the 1540s and 50s, Calvin became the dominant Protestant voice in France. He wrote to his countrymen, quote, "It becomes you to turn your eyes during these great troubles," end quote. But Calvin's experience as a French reformer, don't forget, was entirely as a French reformer in exile. Sure, many followed his example and joined him in exile, but many more did not. Calvin believed a top-down approach to the Reformation in France. Ideally, he hoped to convert either Antoine of Navarre or the Prince of the Conde. Both men would ultimately leave him disappointed. Still, from 1555 on, Reformed churches in France began appearing in large numbers. This was thanks to two phenomena. One, noble protection, and two, noble conversion. By 1559, there were at least 59 Reformed churches across France. Given the level of persecution that persisted, my guess is that the actual number was probably much higher. Many Reformed Christians in France still played the Catholic in public, much to Calvin's dismay. He wrote, exhorting his countrymen to action as follows: "Continue and stop your ears against those who endeavor to turn you from the simplicity of Jesus Christ. Persons whom Paul classes with seducers to inspire us with horror for their deceits and allurements. You know that, though the confession of our faith seemed to be useless in the eyes of men, it is nonetheless well-pleasing and precious in those of God. It remains for you to offer him this complete sacrifice, since it has pleased him to consecrate you in his service." The ascension of Henry II, however, altered matters in France. Henry was determined to punish heresy within his kingdom. After a series of attempts, he personally went to the Paris Parliament in 1559 to learn why his decrees to enforce orthodoxy and Catholicism were not being enforced. Well, it turned out much of the Paris Parliament was Protestant, and this was the answer. This infuriated Henry, who was determined to execute as many leading Protestants as he could. He never got the chance. In June of 1559, Henry was mortally wounded in a freak accident during a jousting match. In what must have been a grisly way to die, Henry succumbed to his injuries 10 days after a large splinter penetrated his eye. The French monarchy passed to the young and sickly Francis II, who was dominated by his regent mother, Catherine de' Medici. Of course, we're going to talk a lot about Francis II and, very much so, the aforementioned Catherine in future episodes. So here I'm just going to focus on the interactions between France and Calvin during this period.
The regency of Francis II gave the Protestant churches of France a bit of breathing space. In 1559, they held their first national synod and requested that Calvin draw up a new confession of faith they could present to the king. Calvin demurred, preferring they adopt the Genevan Confession. But when they did not relent, Calvin went ahead and wrote a new confession. Unfortunately, 1560 proved to be the high-water mark for noble conversions to the Protestant faith. In March of 1560, the ill-fated conspiracy of Ambrose to murder leading members of the ultra-Catholic Guise family failed. Calvin was in a tough position and ultimately sought to distance himself from the event. These efforts were stymied by the fact that there was significant evidence. Calvin sent representatives to take part in the planning of said assassination. The failed conspiracy and the fanatical Guise reaction led Calvin to reconsider his doctrine of authority. For the first time, he began to wonder whether or not secular authorities could be challenged. Events after 1560 would be gripped by a quasi-civil war between the Catholic faction, led by the powerful Guise family, and the Protestants, led by Navarre. Calvin's efforts to convert the entire court of Navarre to the Reformed faith ultimately failed. However, his contacts did reach the then 7-year-old Henry of Navarre, the future King Henry IV. But that, as they say, is a story for another day. This does not mean that Geneva ended its efforts in France. Beginning in 1555, Geneva began its most audacious missionary effort in France. Between 1555 and 1562, over 150 ministers left the relative safety of Geneva to face appalling risks, especially after 1560. Calvin shouldered a significant percentage of the efforts to educate those ministers who left. By 1561, historians estimate that 1,000 students were attending his lectures every day. Of course, there were limits as to how much support Calvin could provide. Geneva at the time was not a large city. There were only a few churches, not nearly enough places for those preparing to face the crucible in France. Still, he did what he could, preaching scripture to students, examining them personally, and, when ready, presenting them to the council for approval. During the years 1560-61, the growth of the Reformed churches in France was nothing less than spectacular. In Rouen, roughly 20% of the population embraced the new faith. And there were limits to Calvin's control over these new communities. When Reformed Christians in Paris desecrated Catholic churches, he deplored their conduct, but no one listened. One of the biggest questions about Calvin is always, why didn't he go back? Why didn't the biggest French reformer in Europe return to France? Calvin himself did answer that question, but his response is a bit perplexing, to say the least. Quote, "Although with little regret I have been absent these 26 years from that native land, which I hold in common with you, and whose agreeable climate attracts many foreigners from the most distant quarters of the world, it would not be pleasing or desirable to me to dwell in a region from which the truth of God, pure religion, and the doctrine of equal salvation have been banished, and the very kingdom of Christ laid prostrate. Hence, I have no desire to return to it." End quote.
I think there are two real answers to the question. First, Calvin believed that remaining in Geneva was an act of divine providence. He consistently spoke of himself as being lifted out of the pit of idolatry that was France at the time by the grace of God. He would preach from afar. Second, I think the answer is just time. He had been gone so long by 1555. What was the point of returning? The time for him to return to France had passed. He said as much himself in 1554, when he wrote, "Since it is not lawful for me to desert the station to which God has appointed me, I have dedicated to you my labor as a pledge until at the completion of my pilgrimage, our Heavenly Father, in his immeasurable pity, shall gather me together with you to his eternal inheritance." But distant from the events unfolding in France, Calvin began to grow frustrated. No one was listening to him, and, as evident from his letters to Bullinger during the early 1560s make clear, as a result, France was slipping into the throes of religious war. He was right to be concerned. On March the 1st, 1562, Guise troops opened fire on 500 Reformed worshippers. By April, violence had broken out across France. In July, Protestants were declared outlaws who could be attacked with impunity. Geneva's policy in all of this was a bit perplexing. It declared neutrality. But why? Why betray the Protestants in France who had, after all, only done what Calvin demanded? The answer is simple. France was close and powerful. Geneva, no matter how firm its religious commitment, was not willing to risk war against so powerful a foe in what certainly would have resulted in Geneva's obliteration. Regardless, for a little while it looked as though Geneva might send military aid into France. But the Peace of Amboise in February 1563 ended any prospect of that. Pursuant to the treaty, Reformed churches were to be allowed in certain parts of France, but not in Paris or its surrounding countryside. Calvin was incensed at the treaty, believing the Protestant cause to have been completely betrayed. Calvin blamed the Protestant Prince of Condé for the debacle, writing to him, "Respecting the conditions of the peace, I know very well, Monseigneur, that it was not easy for you to obtain such as you could have wished. Therefore, if many people desire they had been better, I pray you not think it extraordinary, for in that respect they are exactly of your own opinion. Meanwhile, if God has thrust us back more than we imagined, it is our duty to humble ourselves under his hand." As you can see, Calvin didn't want to lose any remaining influence with the prince, coupling his criticism with explicit advice for the future. He hedged his bets, though, dispatching several key ministers to Navarre to continue his influence there while advising caution to the congregations remaining in France. Calvin was extremely concerned about how the monarchy in France would view recent iconoclastic attacks against Catholic churches in France by Protestant radicals. Just like Luther, he worried that the French would see the Protestants as little better than vandals, and wrote to Henry II in 1561, seeking to distance the Reformation from such acts of violence. Now, simultaneously, Calvin was dealing with an internal revolt over the type of church government that should prevail in the Reformed world. Some prominent Reformed ministers did not like the consistory form of government. They wanted a congregational model, whereby each congregation got to make decisions for itself. This model was also favored by members of the nobility,
who chafed under the strict rules of the consistory. And this movement gained steam after 1562. In the end, while Calvin's name was revered by Protestants throughout France, the French Reform movement had to part ways with Geneva. The simple fact was that Calvin's message of defiance or exile was out of touch with the realities within France, and his refusal to understand the French position caused the French Reform movement to drift away from Geneva, particularly after Calvin's death in 1564. The end for John Calvin was protracted and painful. He was dying, and he knew it. Calvin was suffering from a myriad of medical conditions, including painful kidney stones, which he described to Bullinger in this letter as follows. At present I am relieved from the very acute suffering, having been delivered of a stone about the size of a kernel of a hazelnut. As the retention of urine was excruciating, on the advice of my physician, I mounted a horse, that the jolting might assist in discharging the stone. On my return home, I was surprised to find that I had emitted discolored blood instead of urine. Bedridden and unable to work without the aid of his secretaries, Calvin persisted as best he could. He continued to follow the events in France, while the peace of Amboise and his failing health curbed Calvin's ability to work somewhat. It never completely prevented him from engaging with the scriptures or issuing new opinions. From the end of the summer of 1563 on, Calvin's health went into rapid decline. When he could, he was carried to the church in his chair and did his best to perform baptisms. In February 1564, John Calvin performed his last public duties, from which point he was confined to his bed. By the beginning of March, it seemed like the end was at hand, but he had one last recovery, and joked to friends he had been granted one final reprieve. Calvin made a few more public appearances, thanking the magistrates and citizens for their good wishes and attending Easter services. But by April, he was on death's doorstep. His final moments were among family and friends, and he passed from this world on May 24th, 1564. He was only 55 years old. Martin Luther, by contrast, lived to be 63. Calvin's most likely cause of death was septic shock brought about by kidney stones. Grief fell over Geneva, and many people wanted to see the body. But Calvin never wanted a cult to form around him, and was buried the next day. Calvin's last testament proved to be his closing speech. In it, he touched on some of the most seminal aspects of his life, all of which were brought about by the gracious providence of God. God, he wrote, quote, had been pleased to use me in my labors to teach and know the truth of the gospel, unquote. He did not shy from his shortcomings, in the same document drawing attention to them, writing, but alas, my desires and my zeal, if I may so describe it, have been so cold and flagging that I am conscious of imperfections in all that I am and do. In the end, I think the best we can say of John Calvin was that, while he knew there would be no New Jerusalem on earth, he never stopped trying to build it. Calvin had been preparing for his death his entire life. From his writings dating back to 1534, 30 years earlier, and throughout his revisions of the Institutes, he spoke of a Christian life as a pilgrimage, as a journey toward eternity. Throughout life, Calvin believed the true Christian must have their eyes on eternity at every moment, which means almost a longing for death. What happens after death? Well, unsurprisingly, Calvin was not interested in such speculation. Still, he believed the Bible gave some guidance. At the point of death, he wrote, "The body and the soul separate, the body turning to dust, and the soul proceeding to immediate judgment. From there, the elect proceed to bliss, and the damned to hell." As I mentioned, it was Calvin's wish that he be immediately buried to avoid any cults of personality. In Geneva, there were no sermons or orations spoken in his memory. No one there attempted to portray him as other than what he was, a titan of the Reformation. But his opponents were uninterested in letting the dead man rest in peace. They began attacking him almost before the body was cold. Thus, there was a need for a defense. The first came from Calvin's friend, Theodore Beza, who wrote his defense of Calvinism in 1564. I say Calvinism and not Calvin this time intentionally. Beza didn't write a biography of John Calvin. Rather, he wrote a defense of Calvin's doctrine as a part of a commentary on the book of Joshua. Calvin's friends had cause to publish early and often. His enemies were already at work, portraying him as a tyrannical despot, willing to burn his enemies at the stake. In the end, these efforts would fail, as Calvinism only grew in strength after the death of its founder. Yet it's interesting that in many history books, Calvin still is never portrayed as a venerable figure of the Reformation. That honor still goes almost exclusively to Martin Luther. Though, as I will argue next time, I think that's a mistake. Remember, he was not quite 56 when he died. Bullinger, 7 years older than Calvin, outlived him by 10 years. Melanchthon, always in ill health, outlived Calvin as well. In the end, we remember Calvin less probably because he died relatively young, done in by his own punishing routines. But if Calvin himself would be largely forgotten, Calvinism would triumph. Zwingliism never took hold in Europe to any major extent. Lutheranism dominated Germany, but that was about it. Calvinism and Reformed Christianity would become, in time, the dominant Reformation theology of Western Europe and the New World. Next week, however, we swing south to Italy. Throughout the Reformation in the Empire and Swiss Confederation, the Catholic side has not been idle. Before we close the book on the early Reformation, I want to do two things. Turn and address the Catholic response, and try to put this all in a sort of big context, which we will do in 7 days' time. If you're interested in more content, check out the website at westerncivpodcast.com. For ad-free versions of the show, become a patron at patreon.com/westerncivpodcast. Only $1 a month. Or to hit the reset button and do the whole thing over again with more detail and much better audio quality in the beginning, check out the premium feed at glow.fm/westernciv. Links all in the show notes.